They thought it was just another routine court-martial. I stood at parade rest inside a silent courtroom at Fort Polk, Louisiana, in the spring of 2015. The air felt thick, like it does right before a storm breaks. My dress blues pressed against my shoulders, heavier than any body armor I had ever worn overseas. The projector hummed behind the legal officer as my file loaded onto the screen. No one looked at me. They looked at the charges. Failure to report. Disobeying a direct order. Conduct unbecoming of a non-commissioned officer. Each one sounded neat when spoken out loud. Clean. Simple. Easy to judge. Then the clerk scrolled down and opened my deployment history. The light from the screen washed across the faces of the officers in front of me. I heard the faint spin of the hard drive before the first line appeared. Iraq. Afghanistan. Horn of Africa. Tours stacked one after another. Awards I never talked about. Citations I barely remembered receiving. A chair creaked in the back row. The colonel leaned forward, elbows on the table. That was the moment it stopped being routine. Subscribe to my channel, Lady Veteran Stories, for more real military stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. My name is Staff Sergeant Aaron Callahan. I grew up in Sandpoint, Idaho, the kind of place where winters stretch long and quiet, and everyone knows when you come home on leave. I enlisted at 19 years old in 2007. I thought I would see the world. I did, just not the parts people put on postcards. By the time I stood in that courtroom in the spring of 2015, I had spent more months overseas than I had under my own roof back home. Iraq was dust and long convoys that never really felt routine. Afghanistan was mountains and thin air and radio checks that carried a little too much silence. The Horn of Africa was heat that pressed against your lungs and made you measure every step. None of it felt heroic. It felt like work. Hard work with consequences. In 2014, I was assigned to Fort Polk, Louisiana, as a platoon sergeant in a logistics unit supporting pre-deployment rotations. We were not the unit kicking down doors. We were the ones making sure those units had fuel in their vehicles, water in their trailers, and the right equipment staged before they rolled out to train. It was steady work, predictable most days. We moved fuel tankers through red clay roads that turned to soup after rain. We calculated water distribution down to the last gallon. We tracked manifests and maintenance logs. My soldiers were young. Most of them were between 18 and 22 years old. For many, it was their first time away from home. I took that seriously. The incident that put me in front of a panel started in February during a large-scale field exercise. The temperature climbed faster than forecast. The humidity wrapped around everything. Even before noon, you could see it in the way soldiers moved. Slower. Heavier. Helmets coming off more often than they should. Our job that day was to keep fuel flowing to multiple training lanes. Without fuel, vehicles stop. When vehicles stop, scenarios fall apart. And when scenarios fall apart, senior leaders notice. By early afternoon, our attached medic reported increasing cases of heat stress among the trainees. Not dramatic at first. Just headaches, dizziness, a few near collapses. She recommended adjusting the pace and increasing water resupply. That request went up the chain. The answer that came back was to continue as planned. Higher command was observing the rotation. That phrase traveled through the radio like a warning. No one wanted to be the reason training was paused. Then, one of the trainees went down hard. He did not stumble, he collapsed. Face first into the dirt, the medic rushed him. I watched from beside my lead fuel truck as they rolled him over and cut open his blouse. His skin was pale in a way that did not look right under that Louisiana sun. She called for immediate evacuation and warned that continuing operations increased risk. Again, the instruction from battalion operations was to maintain tempo. I stood there with the radio in my hand and looked at my drivers. They were sweating through their uniforms, waiting on my signal to move forward with the next fuel push. They trusted that if I told them to roll, it was safe enough to roll. I made the call. I ordered my trucks off the line. I directed my soldiers to shut down engines and stand by in place. No further fuel movement until medical cleared conditions. Within minutes, my radio came alive. Staff Sergeant, resume operations immediately. The voice was sharp, controlled, not yelling. That made it heavier. I responded that medical had not cleared the area and that my platoon would hold. The order came again. Resume operations. I refused. Not with anger. Not with drama. Just a calm statement that my soldiers were not moving until I was confident they were not about to become the next casualty. That decision stopped half the exercise. Other lanes stalled when vehicles ran low. Schedules shifted. Observers took notes. By nightfall, I was directed to report to battalion headquarters. The conversation was short. I was informed that I had disobeyed a direct order. An investigation would follow. I was relieved of my duties pending review. On paper, it was simple. I had received a lawful order. I had not complied. In garrison, there are regulations for everything. Paragraphs, subsections, clear language about obedience and authority. There is less space on paper for judgment calls made in heat and dust. The trainee who collapsed survived. He was evacuated in time, but that detail did not erase the fact that I had countermanded a superior officer during a major training event. To the battalion commander, it was insubordination. To me, it was protecting my soldiers from preventable harm. And that difference in perspective is what carried me from a field road lined with pine trees to a quiet courtroom where my entire career would be projected onto a screen. That is how I ended up standing there at parade rest, waiting for strangers in uniform to decide whether I had failed the Army or upheld it. The warning signs started days before anyone hit the dirt. The forecast changed first. What was supposed to be a manageable stretch of late winter heat turned into thick humidity rolling in from the Gulf. You could feel it settling over the training area, heavy and wet. Even before sunrise, the air clung to your skin. During the planning brief, I raised it. We were already tight on water resupply. Another company had underestimated their consumption during a previous lane and pulled from shared reserves. Our numbers were technically within limits, but just barely. When you start a rotation barely inside the line, you usually end up crossing it. Lieutenant Rachel Nguyen, our attached medic, backed me up. She recommended adjusting the timeline, increasing rest cycles, and staging additional water forward before the main push. Major Travis Harlan listened with his hands folded on the table. He did not interrupt. He waited until we finished. Then he said the schedule would remain unchanged. He reminded us that senior evaluators were flying in to observe the rotation. The unit had already been flagged in the previous quarter for falling short on readiness metrics. This was our chance to demonstrate improvement. He used one word that stuck with me: observing. When higher command is observing, everything sharpens. Mistakes feel larger. Delays feel like failures. No one wants to be the officer who pauses training and looks soft. After the brief, I caught Nguyen outside. She was calm, but I could see it in her eyes. She had seen heat casualties before. She told me quietly that we were close to thresholds, especially with the gear the trainees were wearing. I told her to keep me informed of anything unusual. The morning of the exercise, the air felt wrong. Not dramatic, just dense. The kind of heat that does not burn you right away but wears you down slowly. We began fuel movement at first light. Engines idled in a long line, diesel mixing with damp air. My drivers moved efficiently, but I noticed they were drinking more water than usual before we even hit mid-morning. By late morning, I saw the first stumble. Specialist Miguel Alvarez was 19 years old, Texas kid. Quiet, solid worker. He was helping guide a tanker into position when his steps slowed. He blinked hard, like he was trying to clear his vision. I walked over and asked if he was good. He said yes, Sergeant, but his words dragged slightly. Nguyen was already watching. She stepped in, checked his pulse, looked at his eyes. She flagged him for evaluation and had him sit in the shade. That alone was not unusual. Heat stress happens in Louisiana. You treat it early and move on. But then 2 more trainees from a supported unit reported dizziness within the hour. Wynn requested additional water forward and suggested we extend rest cycles. The response from battalion operations was direct: maintain tempo. The phrase sounded harmless over the radio. Maintain tempo. Stay on schedule. Complete objectives. What it meant in practice was fewer pauses, faster turnarounds, less room for adjustment. As the day stretched on, I noticed something else. The trainees were not complaining. They were pushing. No one wanted to look weak in front of evaluators. Pride can be useful in the Army. It can also be dangerous. Around early afternoon, Alvarez stood back up to rejoin the detail. I watched him from a distance. His movements were tighter now. Controlled. Like he was concentrating too hard on something simple. I walked over again. "You sure you are good?" He nodded too fast. That was when he swayed. Not dramatically. Just a small shift in balance. Then he tried to steady himself on the side of the tanker and missed. He went down hard. The sound of his gear hitting the dirt cut through the engine noise. Nguyen was on him in seconds. She called out for assistance, her voice sharp but steady. They rolled him, stripped off excess gear, started cooling measures immediately. She looked up at me once. That look said everything. This is serious. I grabbed the radio and informed battalion that we had a heat casualty requiring evacuation. I recommended pausing fuel movement until we stabilized the situation. There was a short delay before the reply came. Continue operations. Medevac is inbound. Do not disrupt the rotation. I looked around at my platoon. My drivers had shut off their engines without being told. They were watching. They were waiting for me. The line between following orders and protecting your people is not always bright. Sometimes it is a thin thread that only you can see. In that moment, something in my gut tightened. We were close to crossing it. Maybe we already had. By early afternoon, the pattern was no longer subtle. 2 more soldiers from the supported unit were pulled aside by Lieutenant Rachel Nguyen. One was shaking slightly even in the shade. The other kept insisting he was fine, even while his hands trembled when he tried to unclip his vest. Nguyen checked their vitals and looked over at me with that same controlled expression she wore when something was heading in the wrong direction. She got on the radio and requested a pause in operations to reassess heat conditions across the lane. The reply came back fast. Negative. Continue mission. The voice from battalion operations sounded irritated, like we were inconveniencing a schedule, not reporting medical risk. The message was clear. The rotation would not stop for discomfort. I walked down the line of my trucks. My soldiers were not complaining. That was the part that made it worse. They were adjusting straps, wiping sweat from their eyes, forcing energy into their movements. Pride and discipline can carry a soldier a long way, sometimes too far. Engines rumbled. The smell of diesel hung low in the thick air. Even the pine trees around the training area seemed still, like the whole place was holding its breath. Alvarez had been sitting in the shade after his first evaluation. Nguyen had given him fluids and was monitoring him closely. His face looked drawn, pale under the dirt. He tried to stand again. I was about 10 steps away when it happened. There was no dramatic shout. No slow motion. He simply swayed once, like someone losing balance on a boat, and then he dropped straight down. His helmet hit first. His body followed. He did not brace. He did not catch himself. He just went down and did not get back up. For a second, the only sound was the low idle of the trucks. Then Nguyen was moving. She knelt beside him, barking clear instructions. Remove gear. Get ice packs. Call it in. I felt something shift inside me. This was no longer about metrics or evaluation checklists. It was about a 19-year-old soldier lying face down in Louisiana dirt. I grabbed the radio. This is Callahan. We are halting fuel movement until medevac clears the casualty and medical reassesses the lane. I kept my voice steady. Calm, professional. There was a pause. Then the operations officer came on the net personally. Staff Sergeant Callahan, resume operations immediately. Medevac is inbound. The rotation continues. I looked at Alvarez. Wynn was working fast, her jaw tight. His skin had taken on a gray tone that did not belong in sunlight. I keyed the mic again. Sir, we have multiple heat stress cases. Conditions are exceeding safe thresholds. Recommend full pause until cleared by medical. There was no hesitation this time. Negative. That is not your call. Resume operations. That is a direct order. The words settled heavy in my chest. Direct order. Around me, my soldiers were frozen in place. They could hear my side of the conversation. They did not need to hear the other half to understand what was happening. I walked a few steps away from the casualty, not to hide, but to think. The trucks were still running. If I signal forward, they would move. Training would continue. Schedules would be preserved. Observers would see momentum. If I kept them parked, I would be stepping outside my authority. I looked back at Alvarez. Nguyen had started active cooling. Another soldier was fanning him with a clipboard. The medic's face was controlled, but her movements were urgent. This was not theoretical anymore. The operations officer came back on the radio. Staff Sergeant acknowledged the order. I could feel every set of eyes on me. The Army runs on obedience. Without it, nothing works. But it also runs on leaders who understand risk. I pressed the handset closer to my mouth. Sir, my platoon will remain halted until medical clears the area. There was silence on the net, not static, not confusion. Silence. Then his voice again, colder now. You are refusing a direct order. Yes, sir. The word came out steady. It surprised me how steady it sounded. In that moment, something irreversible settled into place. The exercise was no longer just a training event. It was a test of judgment, and I had just chosen my side. Engines idled. Medevac rotors began to thump faintly in the distance. And I knew, even before anyone said it out loud, that this decision would follow me far beyond that dirt road. I remember holding the handset and looking at my drivers. Most of them were barely out of high school, 20 years old, 21. A few were on their second contract, but not many. Their faces were red from heat and sun, streaked with dust and sweat. They were not afraid of hard work. They were afraid of failing. They were waiting on me. The order came again over the net, sharper this time. Resume operations immediately. It would have been easy to give the signal. A hand wave. A nod. Engines would rev, tankers would roll, and the rotation would stay on schedule. The observers would see movement. The battalion would avoid embarrassment. I looked down the line at my soldiers instead. Private First Class Nolan Pierce was gripping his steering wheel tighter than usual. Specialist Tasha Green had her sleeve pushed up, checking the time like she was calculating water intervals in her head. Corporal Dean Whitaker was staring at me, not at the trucks. They trusted me to decide when to move. I pressed the handset to my mouth. Sir, my platoon is standing down until medical confirms safe conditions. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I did not explain again. I just said it. There was a long pause on the radio. Not the kind filled with static, the kind filled with people listening. Then the operations officer came back. You are disobeying a direct order, Staff Sergeant. His tone was controlled. That made it worse. No yelling, no anger, just documentation forming in real time. I acknowledged. Yes, sir. That was it. No speech, no defense. Just acknowledgement. I lowered the radio and walked down the line of trucks. Shut them down, I told my drivers. One by one, engines cut off. The rumble faded until the training area was left with only the distant thud of medevac rotors and the sound of boots shifting in red clay. Without the engine noise, the heat felt louder somehow. Heavy, pressing in. Nguyen was still working on Alvarez. The medevac helicopter was approaching fast now. Dust kicked up in the distance as it prepared to land in a nearby clearing. I stood near the front of the convoy and watched. This was the part no one prepares you for. Not combat, not training. The quiet after you choose. I knew the regulation. I knew what refusing a direct order meant. It did not matter how calm or justified I believed myself to be. On paper, I had crossed the line. Whitaker stepped up beside me. "You good, Sergeant?" I nodded. "We are holding. Drink water. Get your people in shade." No one complained. No one questioned it. They moved with purpose, helping each other unstrap gear, passing canteens, dragging portable shade where they could. The medevac touched down in a cloud of dust and debris. The crew moved quickly, loading Alvarez onto a stretcher. Wynn climbed in with him. As the helicopter lifted off, I felt the weight of what I had just done settle deeper. The radio crackled again. "Staff Sergeant Callahan, you are relieved of control of your platoon effective immediately. Remain in place. Battalion leadership is en route." There it was. Not shouted. Not dramatic. Official. I passed temporary control to Whitaker. He did not ask questions. He just took the clipboard from my hand and nodded once. I stepped back from the line. For the first time all day, I felt the heat on my own skin. The sweat soaking through my uniform, the pounding in my temples. This was no longer about that afternoon. It was about what would follow. When the battalion vehicles arrived, they did not speed in. They rolled up steady, controlled. The battalion commander stepped out first, followed by Major Harlan. Their faces gave nothing away. "Staff Sergeant Callahan," the commander said, "you are to report to headquarters immediately." "Yes, sir." I did not argue. I did not justify. There would be time for that later if it came. As I climbed into the back seat of the command vehicle, I looked once more at my trucks sitting silent in the dirt. They were parked exactly where I had told them to be. And even as the vehicle pulled away, I knew one thing clearly. If I had to choose again in that moment, with the same heat, the same silence, and the same 19-year-old on the ground, I would have kept them parked. The rest of the day moved in slow motion. After the medevac lifted off with Alvarez, the training lanes never fully recovered their rhythm. Fuel movement resumed under temporary supervision, but it felt forced, mechanical. Word had already spread that my platoon had shut down half the rotation. Radios carried more than instructions. They carried opinion. By late afternoon, we learned that Alvarez had been stabilized at the base hospital, but his condition was still listed as critical. Another soldier from a different lane was evacuated shortly after for heat-related symptoms. Not as severe, but serious enough. Nguyen sent a brief update through the chain. She did not editorialize. She never did, just facts. Core temperature elevated. Immediate intervention prevented further decline. Facts can be quiet. They can also be loud. As the sun started to drop, other platoon sergeants stopped by my position. Some kept their voices low. Some avoided eye contact. A few gave me a small nod, the kind that says, "I see what you did, even if I cannot say it out loud." No one openly supported me. No one openly criticized me either. That silence told me everything. By early evening, I was instructed to report to battalion headquarters. I handed temporary control of the platoon to Corporal Whitaker and walked to the administrative building alone. The red clay on my boots had dried into a thin crust. I did not brush it off. Inside, the air conditioning felt almost too cold. Major Harlan and the battalion commander were waiting in a small office. No raised voices. No slammed doors, just two officers behind a desk stacked with folders. "Staff Sergeant Callahan," the commander began, "you are being formally relieved of your position as platoon sergeant pending investigation into your refusal to comply with a direct order." His tone was even, almost procedural. I stood at attention and listened. "You will surrender your platoon property accountability effective immediately. You are not to contact soldiers regarding this matter without authorization. An inquiry will determine whether further action is warranted." I acknowledged each instruction. "Yes, sir." There was no argument. The time for that had passed the moment I said no over the radio. Major Harlan spoke next. His voice carried frustration, but it was contained. Your actions disrupted a critical training event observed by senior leadership. There are channels to address concerns. You chose not to use them. I held his gaze. Sir, I reported medical concerns through the chain prior to halting operations. He did not respond to that directly. The meeting ended as quietly as it began. I signed initial paperwork acknowledging relief of duty. No accusations beyond what was written. No dramatic speeches about discipline or standards, just signatures and dates. As I walked out of headquarters, the sky was dark. The training area lights glowed in the distance. From far away, it looked normal. Trucks moving, soldiers working, the machine continuing. I drove back to the barracks and sat in my car for a long minute before stepping out. I knew what relief of duty meant in a unit. Whispers, assumptions, people deciding what kind of leader you are based on one line in a report. That night, my phone stayed quiet. No official updates, no reassurance, just time to think. Combat is loud. You expect incoming rounds, dust clouds, shouted commands. Your body reacts instantly. Decisions are made under fire and measured in seconds. This felt different. This was quiet, and in that quiet, the consequences moved slowly toward me. The investigation process began the next morning. Statements were taken. Radio logs reviewed. Medical reports requested. Everything documented in precise language. Failure to obey a lawful order. Dereliction of duty. Potential violation of good order and discipline. On paper, it looked simple. There was an order. I did not follow it. What paper does not capture well is hesitation. Context. The look on a medic's face when a soldier stops responding. I slept poorly that week, not because I doubted my choice, but because I knew how the system works. Intent is not always the deciding factor. Authority carries weight. Discipline sustains structure. I had challenged both. Days later, I was formally notified that the matter would proceed to a court-martial hearing to determine accountability. When I read the notice, I did not feel anger. I felt something heavier, responsibility. Not just for what I had done, but for what it meant to challenge a direct order in garrison. The Army depends on obedience. Without it, nothing holds. But it also depends on leaders willing to assess risk honestly. Somewhere between those two truths is where I stood. And as the paperwork moved forward, I understood something clearly. The silence of that headquarters office, the calm tone of the commander, the steady signatures on official forms, all of it carried more weight than any firefight I had ever been in. Because in combat, chaos comes fast and leaves fast. In garrison, consequences arrive slowly, and they stay. Weeks later, the investigation concluded. I was called back to battalion headquarters and handed a copy of the findings. The language was measured, controlled, the kind of writing that removes emotion on purpose. The report stated that I had acted outside my authority by halting fuel operations after receiving a lawful direct order to continue. It confirmed that the order itself was lawful under existing training guidelines. It also confirmed that heat index readings had exceeded recommended thresholds for sustained activity in full gear. Both statements sat on the same page. No commentary, no judgment, just facts placed side by side. Alvarez survived. He was 19 years old. The doctors stabilized him, but the damage had already been done. His kidneys had taken a hit they would not fully recover from. He would need monitoring for the rest of his life. Limited duty status was discussed. Medical boards were mentioned. That detail never appeared in the charge sheet drafted against me. The charge sheet focused on refusal, failure to obey, undermining command authority. When I received notice that the case would proceed to a court-martial hearing, I felt strangely calm. I had expected administrative action, maybe a letter of reprimand, possibly reduction in rank. I had not expected a formal proceeding. But once it was set in motion, it moved steadily. On the morning of the hearing, I stood again at parade rest in that quiet courtroom at Fort Polk. The panel members filed in, uniforms crisp, faces neutral. The process was deliberate. The charges were read aloud. They sounded clean. Failure to obey a lawful order. Conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. There is something about hearing your name attached to those words that settles into your chest differently than seeing them on paper. I answered the required questions clearly. Yes, sir. No, sir. Then the legal officer began presenting evidence. Radio transcripts were displayed first. My words, typed in black text, the operations officer's responses. The acknowledgement of a direct order. It looked simple, projected on a screen. Then my personnel file was opened. I did not know they intended to review my entire service record. I assumed they would focus on the incident itself. The projector hummed as page after page loaded. Deployment history. Iraq, 2008. Afghanistan, 2010. Horn of Africa, 2012. Training citations. Performance evaluations. The room shifted subtly, not dramatically. No gasps, just posture changes. Heads leaning slightly closer to the screen. Each evaluation report included sections written by different commanders over the years. Different units, different theaters. The language varied, but one phrase appeared again and again in different forms, demonstrates unwavering commitment to soldier welfare. Places mission success and soldier safety in balance. Protects her soldiers, even at personal cost. Those lines had never meant much to me when I read them at the time. They were part of the process. Standard evaluation language. But seeing them stacked together, year after year, created a pattern. Not heroics. Not glory. Context. The panel members were not looking at medals. They were looking at consistency, a career built on risk assessments made under pressure, a reputation for speaking up when something felt wrong. The legal officer paused briefly as another evaluation scrolled into view. In high-stress environments, maintains composure and prioritizes subordinate safety. No one said anything. The colonel at the center of the panel leaned back slightly, folding his hands. The case was no longer just about one afternoon in Louisiana heat. It was about judgment over time. When I was asked to speak, I did not deliver a speech. I did not reference deployments or decorations. I did not defend my record. I explained my decision in simple terms. I assessed risk. I weighed the order against medical input. I made a call. I accepted that it placed me outside my authority. I also accepted that if faced with the same conditions, I would make the same call again. There was no anger in the room, just consideration. The operations officer testified as well. He stated clearly that he had given a lawful order and that maintaining the rotation was critical to mission objectives. He did not exaggerate. He did not attack my character. The medical testimony confirmed elevated heat index levels and increasing casualty risk. Both sides were presented with professionalism. By the time arguments concluded, the atmosphere felt less adversarial and more reflective. The panel recessed to deliberate. As I stood alone in that room waiting for them to return, I understood something clearly. This was the turning point. Not because of punishment, but because whatever they decided would define how that line between obedience and responsibility was interpreted in my career. When they came back in, the colonel's expression was steady. The finding acknowledged that I had technically disobeyed a direct order. It also acknowledged that my actions were taken in good faith, grounded in documented medical risk, and consistent with a service record demonstrating a pattern of protecting subordinates. The words were careful, but they mattered. At that moment, the incident stopped being a single act of defiance. It became part of a larger story, one that had been building quietly across years and deployments. Protects her soldiers, even at personal cost. That line, repeated over time, had carried more weight than I ever realized. The colonel recessed the hearing after the final statements were read. The panel stepped out without drama. Chairs scraped lightly against the floor. The door closed with a soft click. I stood alone at the front of the courtroom, hands clasped behind my back, staring at the blank projector screen that had held my entire career only minutes before. When they returned, their faces were composed, professional, deliberate. The colonel spoke first. The panel acknowledged that a lawful direct order had been given and that I had refused to comply. On paper, that fact did not change. But the panel also acknowledged the context. Witness statements from Lieutenant Rachel Nguyen confirmed that heat index readings had exceeded recommended thresholds. She testified that she had advised adjustments prior to the incident and that, in her medical opinion, continued operations significantly increased risk. Two senior non-commissioned officers from neighboring units provided statements as well. They confirmed visible signs of heat stress across multiple lanes and corroborated the sequence of radio communications. None of them exaggerated. None of them dramatized. They simply described what they saw. The colonel paused briefly before continuing. Intent matters in leadership. That sentence settled into the room quietly. The panel determined that while I had technically disobeyed a direct order, my actions were taken in good faith based on reasonable assessment of risk to subordinate soldiers. The matter would be reduced to a formal letter of reprimand placed in my file. No reduction in rank. No forfeiture of pay. No discharge. No discharge. Administrative consequences, not career-ending ones. I felt relief, but it was not the kind that makes you exhale sharply. It was steadier than that, a release of pressure that had been building for weeks. Major Travis Harlan received administrative action as well. It was handled quietly through command channels. No public acknowledgement, no spectacle. The Army does not often make examples of its own mistakes loudly. Corrections happen in memos and meetings behind closed doors. When the hearing concluded, there was no applause, no congratulations. A few officers nodded at me as they filed out. Not approval. Not disapproval. Just acknowledgement. I walked out of the building alone. The air outside felt different than it had weeks earlier. Lighter somehow. The sky was clear. Training lanes in the distance continued as usual. Trucks rolled. Soldiers moved. The machine kept turning. I returned to duty, but not immediately to my old position. Trust takes time to rebuild, even when discipline is preserved. I accepted that. Leadership is not about winning arguments. It is about carrying outcomes. Months later, I received a message from the base hospital. Alvarez wanted to see me. I met him near the outpatient clinic on a humid afternoon. He looked thinner. He moved slower than I remembered. There was a stiffness to him that had not been there before. He was still 19 years old. He wore civilian clothes that hung slightly loose at the shoulders. His handshake was firm, but I could see the fatigue in his eyes. "They told me what you did, Sergeant," he said. I did not know what to say at first. He did not speak dramatically. He did not turn it into something larger than it was. He just said, "Thank you for stopping the trucks." That was it. No long speech, no emotion on display. Just simple gratitude. We stood there in silence for a moment. He told me he was being evaluated for long-term monitoring, that he might not be able to deploy the way he once planned, that he was figuring out what came next. I listened. When he left, he walked carefully across the parking lot, shoulders squared, trying to move like nothing had changed. But something had. For me. For me. That handshake meant more than any ribbon I had pinned on my uniform. Ribbons mark events. That handshake marked consequence. The letter of reprimand stayed in my file. It followed me to future boards and assignments. It was a reminder that judgment is rarely clean. But so was the rest of my record. Protects her soldiers. Even at personal cost. I understood then that leadership is not about avoiding mistakes entirely. It is about choosing which consequences you are willing to carry. No one celebrated the outcome of that court-martial. It was not a victory. It was a line drawn and examined. And months later, standing in a hospital parking lot watching a 19-year-old soldier walk carefully toward his car, I knew I would carry that line again if I had to. People think court-martials are about crime. Sometimes they are about judgment. Standing in that quiet courtroom, I understood that nothing I had done overseas was what carried weight in that moment. It was not the deployments, not the awards, not the places I had been. It was the pattern of smaller decisions made when no one was watching. The steady choice to look at my soldiers first before I looked up the chain. Leadership is not loud. It does not come with music or applause. Most of the time, it is quiet and uncomfortable. It is standing still when pressure tells you to move. It is accepting that doing the right thing might cost you position, reputation, or promotion. I lost a platoon that day. I gained something harder to define: clarity. I learned that orders matter. Discipline matters. Structure matters. But so do the faces in front of you. So does the 19-year-old who trusts you to bring him home in one piece. Alvarez still sends me a message every year on the anniversary of that exercise. Just a simple note saying he is doing all right, that he is grateful, that he made it home. That is enough for me. The Army teaches you to follow orders. It also teaches you responsibility. Sometimes those two collide. When they do, you carry the outcome for the rest of your life. I can live with mine. Subscribe to my channel, Lady Veteran Stories, for more real military stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from.